Hi everyone, and welcome back to NPR's Microeconomics video lessons. In today's video, we'll be going over some of the exam questions from previous years, which will help you get ready for your midterm and your final. So in today's video, we'll be going over the supply and demand part of the exam, while check out the other exam questions video on consumer choice and utility. You can also find all exams from previous years in our Google Drive. And if you have any questions about any of the problems, shoot me a direct message and I'll answer in no time. All right, let's get on to it. If an increase in the price of good A leads to a decrease in demand for good B, then A and B are A complements, B inferior goods, C normal goods, D substitutes, and E none of these answers. So right away we can cancel out B and C, because in order to determine inferior and normal goods, we need to see the relationship between our income and quantity demanded. And so in this case, there's no information on our change in income. So it cannot be B or C, because we're talking about different prices and demand for two different goods. So there's no relation to our income at all. So right away we can cancel out B and C. And so let's take an example in order to understand this question better of iPhones and iPhone cases. For instance, if the price for your iPhones increases drastically to 2,000 euros, then you'll obviously start buying less iPhones, or generally the demand for iPhones will decrease because it's too expensive now. And on the other hand, at the same time, the quantity demanded for iPhone cases also decrease, because you always buy these two goods together, right? So they're complementing each other. There's a direct relationship. So in this case, we can say those two goods are complement goods because you buy them together. So as the price for one good increases, the demand for good B, for our iPhone cases, decreases. So that's why our answer is A in this case, is the complements. Well, it would have been the opposite case for substitutes, when, for instance, the price of good A, which could be Pepsi, increases, and then the demand for good B, which would be Coke, also increases. So that in this case, there are substitutes, because you're just substituting one good for another. So, but since it's not the case for this problem, it has to be A. Now, question 2, if the price of a good is lower than the equilibrium price, here are the different options. And let's take a look at my iPad screen and see how we can answer this question. So here we see a perfect allocation of resources in the market. We have a market equilibrium at P star and Q star. So our market clearing price is P star. There's perfect allocative efficiency, and our resources are maximized. And so we're told that our price is set below the equilibrium price. So now there will be a misallocation of resources. There will be no longer the perfect situation in the market, which is a more realistic model of the real world, of course. And so we can set the price below the equilibrium point and then set it at P2. What we see here, and now there are two intersection points for the supply and demand. So there's a movement along the demand curve, and now we see that the quantity supply decreases to QS, because producers are less willing to produce at lower price levels. Well, it's the opposite case for consumers, because then obviously at a lower price there will be more quantity demanded, stated by law of supply as well, law of demand as well. And so our quantity demanded is now significantly is greater than quantity supplied. So we can say that our quantity demanded is greater. So there's excess demand in the market. So there's a shortage. So the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, it's our shortage in the market, which should have been different. We would call it a surplus if, for instance, the price was above the equilibrium point. And so in this case, it would flip, and the quantity supplied will be higher than quantity demanded. But in this case, since it's below, we have a shortage. And so to answer this question, there will be a shortage in the market, and so to fix that, so our supply curve will shift to the right to meet the new equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied, and so our supply curve would shift to the right. So we can see here that will be our new supply curve at S2. It's not straight, but we can see that it simply shifts to the right, and and so as a result, there will be more supplied quantity and more demanded quantity as well in the market. So it increases to the right, while our price decreases to P2. So if we go back to the original question, so we see it has to be B. So as I mentioned, there's a shortage and the quantity supplied will rise to meet the new demand. And so in the end, it has to be B. Question 3, suppose there's a decrease in both supply and demand for good 1. So, and further suppose the supply for good 1 decreases by more than demand for this good. So in the market for good 1, we would expect, and so these are the different options. And now, once again, let's take a look at the screen to have a visual presentation of the situation and then answer the question. Now, again, let's take a look at this diagram. So we know that there's a shift for both supply and demand curves to the left. There's a decrease in both supply and demand. However, we also know that our supply will decrease by more than our demand. So that's why we can see the significant shift of the leftward shift of the supply curve and also a smaller shift of the demand curve. And what happens is that, first of all, we have our initial point, our equilibrium point at Q1 and P1, which is represented right here. And now the new intersection point of the S2 and D2 curves is at this point right here. So obviously, in order to properly answer this question, to visualize it, it's always better to graph it because it's hard to visualize it in your head. So always just on the side, you can always take a quick note during the exam, for instance, and just kind of just quickly draw them to see the final impact. But you can see here now our quantity demanded, our final quantity decreases from Q1 to Q2, so there's a significant decrease, while our price increases from P1 to P2. So this is our new equilibrium point. And so actually it would be a different case, for instance, if our demand would have been, our change in demand would have been greater than supply, so it would have been the opposite. So in this case, our quantity demand would still, our final quantity would still decrease, but our price will also decrease. But in this case, we have a greater shift in supply. So when we go back to the question, we see that the answer has to be C, as at the equilibrium, the quantity decreases, as I said, from Q1 to Q2, and the price rises from P1 to P2. So the answer is C. Now, question 4, consider that the income elasticity of demand for good A is 0.2. What should be the consequence coming from a 10% increase of the unit price of this good? So remember, our income elasticity of demand formula, first of all, is the change in quantity demanded over change in income. And so first of all, let's look at the answers. A is 50% decrease of the total demanded quantity. B, 0% decrease of the total demanded quantity. C, 2% increase of the unit price. D, rational. E, none of these answers. So we can see that we are given 2 bits of information here. One is our income elasticity, which is 0.2. First of all, also we know it's a normal good since it's positive. So as our income increases, our quantity demanded also increases. But in this case, we're also given an increase in unit price. However, remember that in order to find the relationship between price and quantity demanded, we have to look at our price elasticity of demand. But since we're given income elasticity of demand, if we're not given any information on our income change or quantity demanded, we cannot answer this question because there are 2 different bits of information that are used to find different parts that we would need for either income or price elasticities. So if we were given a 10% increase in income, then we could have answered this question. But since it is a unit price and we're not asked the price elasticity of demand, the correct answer is actually E, none of these answers, because of these 2 completely different bits of information that we are given, and it's there to trick us. But you'll know now that you have to remember your formulas. So in this case, our information is not relevant to find either income elasticity or price elasticity of demand. So now moving on to the word problem. So the demand of books in France depends on the price P according to quantity demanded. And we're giving a function here. And then supply of books is given by quantity supplied and given a different function. And so now we need to determine the equilibrium price and quantities of the market for books. And we need to graphically represent this equilibrium. Then in question 2, compute the consumer surplus. Question 3, the government introduces a 15 euro tax per unit produced, and we determine the new equilibrium and present it graphically. So before we get into the step-by-step solution, I'd like to just explain, first of all, it's important to know that for question 3, we have a 15 euro tax per unit produced. So we know that this will be impacting our producer, our supply side of the market, because it could also be a tax imposed on consumers, so it could be an income tax. But since it's specified that it's a tax per unit produced, that means it has to be a corporate tax. And so now our cost of production increases for producers, and so they're less willing and able to produce at each price unit. So that's why the supply will actually shift to the left. So there will be less supply in the market due to this corporate tax. And lastly, for question 4, we need to compute now the new consumer surplus after taxation, and then find the variation of consumer surplus. So now let's take a look at my screen and look at a solution to this problem. So in order to find the equilibrium point for the first question, we simply need to make the quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied, which we did right here. So we're making the quantity demanded function equal to the quantity supplied. While we're solving for P, we're finding the equilibrium price, which will be 80. We're going to simplify this equation. And then we'll plug in 80 back into the original function, one of the two. And for instance, we'll get 80 minus 20 if we plug it back into the quantity supplied. And we'll find our equilibrium quantity at 60. But in order to graph it, what's important to note is that you always need to graph the inverse functions for supply and demand. So what does it mean? In order to find the inverse functions, we simply need to rewrite both of the equations in terms of quantity instead of price. So we're making now price equal to a certain function in terms of quantity. So we're just rewriting. So for instance, for quantity supplied, it was quantity supplied equals to P minus 20. Now we're rewriting it and getting P is equal to quantity supplied plus 20. And same goes for quantity demanded. This is our final function here. So it's P is equal to 200 minus 2Q. And so this is the same two functions, the two graphs we see here represented by these two functions. And so now we graphically see what's happening, and we were able to find the consumer surplus, which will be our question 2. In order to find it, that's the area of the triangle. And so as we briefly mentioned, I mentioned this in one of the previous lessons. To find it, we will find the area by finding the length first. So it's 200 minus 80, so that's this part of the triangle, then times 60, so this is this length, and divided by 2, so we have a triangle area. And then in the end, we get 3,600, that's our consumer surplus, which will be actually equal to the producer surplus, because when there's the perfect allocative efficiency in the market, the producers and consumer surpluses are always equal. They're both maximized. So that's why the producer surplus would also be 3,600. So now moving on to the third question. So as I mentioned earlier, we know that the tax is introduced and is imposed on producers, and that's why there's a shift of the supply curve to the left. So now we see the shift from S1 to S plus tax. And so in order to determine the new equilibrium price and quantity, we simply need to add 15 to our supply side, our supply function. So that's what we did here. So you can see we added 15, that's our tax, to Q plus 20, and we're keeping obviously the quantity, so our demand side the same, which is still 200 minus 2Q. And now we find the new equilibrium Q and P, which is 55 and 90, and we see it right here, which is represented by 55 and 90 here. And so right away, we see that the consumer surplus decreases. We see the triangular area is much smaller compared to the original one here. And so to find it, again, it's the same process. We do now 200 minus 90, and then times 55, the new length, divided by 2. So now the new consumer surplus is 3,025. And our producer surplus will actually increase. Now will be larger than consumer surplus. And at this point, what's interesting to note, we have a deadweight loss, or it's also called a welfare loss, a small triangle here, and it's the benefits lost to society due to this misallocation of resources. Now, the resources are not perfectly allocated, so this is not the optimal equilibrium point, and that's why we have this loss, this small area. So sometimes you might be asked to find it, and again, you just follow with a similar structure for areas of triangles. And so lastly, to find the consumer surplus variation, we simply need to subtract, we take the difference between our final consumer surplus and the initial consumer surplus, and we see that it will be negative 575. So that's our consumer variation and the answer to our last question. All right, this wraps up our video. Check out the rest of our videos and our drive for more exam type of questions, for more exercises and word problems. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a direct message. I'll answer as soon as possible. Thank you for watching and see you later.